Hi, my name is Jim, and in this video I'm going to show you how to get started with Longhorn distributed block storage and cloud native distributed SQL all running on Google Kubernetes engine. If you're new to distributed SQL, you're probably asking yourself, what is YugabyteDB? YugabyteDB is an open source, high performance distributed SQL database that's built on a scalable and fault tolerant design that's been inspired by Google Spanner. Yugabyte SQL API, or YSQL as you'll see it referred to in the docs, is Postgres wire compatible. All right, what is Longhorn? Longhorn is cloud native distributed block storage, perfect for Kubernetes environments. It's open source. It supports incremental snapshots and backups, and it's a project that's sponsored by the folks over at Rancher. So why Longhorn and YugabyteDB? Well, YugabyteDB is a distributed SQL database that's going to require stateful sets and persistent storage when it's running in a Kubernetes environment. So by using Longhorn, Longhorn can actually do the disk management, the provisioning, the backups, and the snapshots so that Yugabyte can kind of offload those duties to software that's designed to handle those sorts of activities well. They both support multi-cloud deployments, so if the organization wants to, say, deploy a distributed SQL cluster that's going to span multiple clouds, Longhorn is a vehicle that can help enable that sort of a deployment. And finally, in the event that you lose a node inside of a YugabyteDB cluster, instead of having to copy data from a remote node, say for example your nodes are spread out geographically, with Longhorn you're going to be able to have a faster recovery or a rehydration of those new nodes because you're going to be copying data locally as opposed to sending it over the wire via a different geography. So the combination of Longhorn and Yugabyte is going to give you much faster recovery in the event of a node failure. All right, so let's take a look at what our demo environment is going to look like for the rest of this particular video. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to install YugabyteDB 2.1 via Helm. We're going to install Rancher 2.4 via Docker, Longhorn via the Rancher UI, and then manage VM instances and Kubernetes clusters via the Google console. So first things first, you're going to want to create a service account with the necessary IAM roles for the VM instance that we're going to be running on Ubuntu. And you can click on the link in the video description for the blog post that goes into all the details for the appropriate permissions that you're going to need. But this is just really to give you a snapshot that says, hey, you're going to need to create a service account and you're going to need to assign some pretty specific roles to it in relation to the project, right? So once you get that accomplished, the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and spin up a VM instance. And we're going to toggle now over to Compute Engine, VM instances. We're going to want to create one, and I'm creating it inside of my Longhorn demo project. Give it a name if you don't like the default. And for the purposes of this particular demo, I'm going to go with an N1 standard 2, which is going to give me 7.5 gigs of memory. The other thing that you want to do here is that you want to change the boot disk, and I'm going to change the boot disk to Ubuntu. You want to select the 18.04 LTS version. You can leave the disk size as is. And the other thing to remember is to allow HTTPS traffic for this particular instance, and go ahead and click Create. Instance is live and running. We're going to want to open up a shell so we can then go ahead and install Rancher. So now we're going to install Rancher via Docker, and if your shell complains that you don't have Docker installed, check out the links inside of the blog post. That'll tell you how to get Docker up and running on your VM. But if you do actually have it already installed, then you can just go ahead and run the Rancher install command. All right, so now that Rancher is installed, we're ready to go ahead and move to installing Longhorn. All right, to install Longhorn, we're going to want to use this external IP that we've got here inside of the console. So we're just going to go ahead and copy that link And then what I want to do now is, for whatever reason, Firefox works better, so that's what I'm going to go with for the UI. And go ahead and get to the Rancher UI. And the first thing that you're going to need to do is to go ahead and set a password for the admin account. Note your Rancher server URL. And then now that we're inside of the UI, the next thing to do is going to be to get is to add a cluster by clicking on the Add Cluster button. And obviously we're going to do that on GKE. You can name your cluster whatever you want. Here we're just going to call it Longhorn Demo. And if you recall at the very beginning of the video, we talked about our service account. So what you want to do is that you're going to want to go back to the Google console, IAM and admin, locate your Longhorn account that you created, and you're going to want to generate from it, from the service account, you're going to want to generate your key. And when you create that key, it gets downloaded, and then you are going to want to upload it, right, to our service account information here. So we click on Read from File, go to Downloads. We see that there. Open it up. Boom. Now it's there. Now for the rest of the stuff in here, there's a couple of changes that I made for the purposes of this demo, and that is, first, I'm going to change this up to a N1 standard 4, and I'm going to enable node pool auto scaling, and I'm going to set my maximum node count to 24 and click the Create button. So it's going to be a couple of minutes here while the provisioning happens, and once that's done, we should see this particular cluster move into an active state. All right, so now that our cluster has moved into an active state, we're ready to install Longhorn. So what we're going to do is that we are going to go up to the top nav, select Longhorn Demo and System. And then from here, we want to click on Apps. And from the apps, we're going to want to then search for Longhorn in the catalog, locate it, click on it. And once that we've clicked on it, we can go ahead and either go with the defaults, give it a new name, however you see fit. But at the end of the day, you can go ahead and keep everything that's here by default and click the launch button. Now, this again is going to take a couple of minutes, as all things do with Kubernetes running on Google. And once that's done, we're going to be ready to go ahead and pull up the Longhorn UI. So now that our Longhorn cluster is set to the active state, we can then click on this index hyperlink, and you can see that we've gone ahead and got our basic provisioning. So this means now that we've got our storage prepped, we're now ready to then flip back over to GKE and install Yugabyte on this Kubernetes cluster. So let's do that next. All right, back over to GKE. We're going to want to open up our shell, and now we're ready to start executing the commands that are going to be necessary to install Yugabyte. I won't go into a ton of detail on these particular commands. You can see them in the blog post, but we're just going to walk through them to get up and running with the YugabyteDB cluster on this particular Kubernetes cluster. Let's create our service account for Yugabyte. Let's initialize Helm. Let's create a namespace. Let's add the charts repo. Let's fetch our updates. And now we're ready to go ahead and install Yugabyte. And I'm going to be installing it specifying Longhorn as my storage class, and I'm going to be setting my resources, understanding that I'm in a relatively constrained environment, and that's the command that I'm going to use here. So this is going to take a couple of minutes to spin up. Once the Yugabyte install command is complete, this is the output that you should see that tells us that Yugabyte is up and running. We can also, if we come back over to the console, if we look at workloads, we can see Yugabyte there. And if we click on services and ingress, we can also see the various YugabyteDB services there up and running. So the next thing we want to do is, let's just go ahead and copy this link, this master UI. This is going to give us a basic browser view of the Yugabyte cluster that we just installed. So you see that there. The next thing to do, though, is to go back to Longhorn and see how we're looking here. And you can see here in the UI, we've now got the 12 volumes. Storage has been allocated to my YugabyteDB cluster. And if we go back to Kubernetes engine and we go to the storage view, you can see that all my storage has been allocated to my YugabyteDB cluster. So coming back to the terminal, let's go ahead and jump into the Yugabyte YSQL shell. And you want to remember that this YSQL shell is going to be Postgres compatible. And that's it. So right at this point, I am ready to start creating database objects, loading data in, doing CRUD operations, etc., knowing that I have my distributed block storage on the back end via Longhorn. And that's it. What's next? If you've got any questions on how to get Yugabyte up and running on GKE or how distributed SQL works, join us on Slack. That's where we hang out. That's the best place to start conversations. If you like what you see, we always appreciate a star on GitHub. If you want to learn more about Longhorn, check out the docs. If you want to learn more about YugabyteDB, the docs are a great resource as well. That's it. We'll see you next time in another video.